You are holding a piece of plastic roughly the size of a deck of cards. And somehow, this small object changed the entire trajectory of human entertainment. Before 1976, every video game console was a single-purpose machine. The game was baked directly into the hardware. When you were done with it, you were just done. You spent $200 on a box that played exactly one game. If you wanted something different, you bought an entirely different console. The industry treated this as normal. Software distributed on magnetic tape or cassette could be duplicated by anyone with a second tape deck. Piracy was not a future concern. It was already here. The answer came from Fairchild Semiconductor, a storied chip company in Santa Clara, California. In 1976, their engineers set out to solve both problems at once. The man at the center was Jerry Lawson, a self-taught engineer and one of the very few black hardware designers in Silicon Valley at the time. He was about to change everything. Lawson's team built the Fairchild Channel F, a console with a slot in the front. You slid in a cartridge. The console read whatever was stored inside and played it. Inside each cartridge sat a read-only memory chip, a ROM. The data was physically burned into it during manufacturing. You could not erase it, could not copy it, and it loaded instantly. That last part mattered most. A ROM chip could not be duplicated on a cassette deck or a photocopier. The software was locked in silicon. For the moment, piracy was solved. Atari had already made a fortune with Pong, and now they saw what interchangeable cartridges could mean for their business. They moved fast. In 1977, Atari released the 2600, a wood-grain console with a cartridge slot. It was not the first cartridge system. It would become the most important. For the first time, the game and the hardware were decoupled. You bought the console once, then kept buying cartridges. It was a razor and blades business model, and it worked spectacularly. Because anyone could now publish for the platform, third-party developers emerged. Activision was founded in 1979 by Atari programmers who wanted credit and royalties for their own work. The late 70s and early 80s were a gold rush. Hundreds of titles flooded the market. Atari's revenue climbed into the billions. The cartridge had created an entire industry. But Atari's open licensing invited anyone to publish anything. By 1982, shelves were crowded with rushed, barely functional games, and consumers had no reliable way to tell the good from the bad. The most infamous casualty was the 1982 tie-in for E.T. the Extraterrestrial, developed in roughly 5.5 weeks to make the holiday season. It was widely considered unplayable. In 1983, the North American market collapsed. Revenue fell from an estimated $3.2 billion to around $100 million in under 2 years. Retailers walked away entirely. In Japan, Nintendo had released the family computer, the Famicom, in 1983 with far stricter quality controls. They wanted to bring it to America. America was not interested. American retailers wanted nothing to do with video games. The crash was too recent, so Nintendo reframed their product as a toy and landed it in the toy aisle instead. The NES launched in New York City in late 1985. Nintendo bundled in a plastic robot called ROB, whose only real job was to make the box look like a toy. Nintendo built something new into their cartridges, the 10NES chip, a hardware lockout. Any cartridge without a matching chip simply would not work. Unlicensed games were blocked at the hardware level. To sell games on the NES, you played by Nintendo's rules, a cap on releases per year, strict quality approval, and manufacturing through Nintendo itself. The era of unregulated publishing was over. Here is where gaming's most persistent myth was born. Your game glitches, you blow into the cartridge. Players swore it worked. They were not entirely wrong, just wrong about why. The blowing did nothing useful. The real problem was the 72-pin connector inside the console, which wore out and lost contact. Reinserting the cartridge fixed it. The blowing just introduced moisture. By the end of the decade, the NES was in 1 in 3 American homes. The cartridge format, nearly killed by Atari's excess, had been rescued by Nintendo's rigor. Nintendo released the Super Famicom in Japan in 1990, and the Super NES reached North America a year later. Some cartridges even contained custom chips inside, squeezing power the console itself could not provide. Sega challenged Nintendo throughout the early 90s, and the console wars became a cultural fixture. Both sides competed entirely within the cartridge format, which was starting to look expensive beside a new rival. The compact disc, commercially introduced in 1982 as an audio format, could hold far more data than any ROM cartridge, and cost a fraction as much to manufacture. Before that disruption hit home consoles, Nintendo had already solved a different problem. In 1989, designer Gunpei Yokoi introduced the Game Boy, a handheld console with a cartridge slot on the side. The Game Boy cartridge was tiny, nearly indestructible, and elegant in its simplicity. Children carried them in pockets, lost them in sofa cushions, and found them years later still holding their saved games. Competitors offered color screens and faster chips. The Game Boy had neither, but it had better games and a longer battery life. It sold over 100 million units across its lifespan. In 1994, Sony launched the PlayStation in Japan, running entirely on compact disc. Developers could suddenly fit orchestral soundtracks and hours of content onto a single disc that cost far less to produce than a cartridge. A PlayStation disc cost roughly $10 to manufacture. A comparable Nintendo 64 cartridge could cost several times more. Developers passed that gap to consumers, and every studio in the industry noticed. Nintendo's answer was the 64, released in 1996, still running on cartridges. Nintendo argued that instant load times justified the premium. Many of their most important partners disagreed. Final Fantasy, once a Nintendo-exclusive franchise, jumped to PlayStation with its 7th installment in 1997. It was a seismic moment. The cartridge bore much of the blame. The PlayStation 2, released in 2000, used DVDs. The GameCube used miniature optical discs. By the early 2000s, the home console cartridge was functionally extinct. Portable gaming was different. The Game Boy Advance in 2001, the DS in 2004, and the 3DS in 2011 all kept the cartridge format alive. In the background, a new type of memory was quietly maturing. Flash memory, the same technology inside your smartphone, was rewritable, compact, and getting dramatically cheaper every year. In March 2017, Nintendo launched the Switch, a console you could play on a television or carry out the door. In the slot on the right side sat a cartridge. The gaming world stopped and stared. Cartridges had been absent from home consoles for nearly 20 years. Nintendo had just brought them back, and somehow it made immediate, obvious sense. Switch cartridges run on flash memory, not ROM. They are writable during manufacturing, load instantly, and hold up to 32 gigabytes of data. The soul of Lawson's invention, built for a new century. Nintendo coated the cartridges in denatonium benzoate, one of the most bitter substances known to chemistry, after incidents of small children trying to put them in their mouths. It reportedly works. Streaming had made people anxious about who actually owns their media. A cartridge, like a book, is yours. No server can take it away. No subscription required. A secondary market exploded. Sealed switch games became sought-after collector items. First-run cartridges appreciated in value. The format once sold for $2.99 at a garage sale was now tracked on spreadsheets. Jerry Lawson never became a household name during his lifetime. He died in 2011. Google honored him with a tribute a full decade later. The format he built outlived every prediction about its irrelevance. In roughly 50 years, the cartridge went from anti-piracy tool to symbol of a golden age, to near extinction, and back again as a collector's treasure. The same essential idea, carrying everything. A cartridge is just a chip in a shell software given a physical home. Something about that physicality keeps mattering to people in ways that are hard to name but impossible to ignore. This is Origins. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. There's a new origin every single morning.